Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lars Schall, and on behalf of Matterhorn Asset Management, I'm sitting right now at a conference room in the Hampshire Hotel in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. And with me sits here U.S. financial analyst Catherine Austin-Fitz. Hello, Catherine.
Lars, what a pleasure to finally meet you in person.
Yeah, I feel privileged too. But actually, the reason why you're here in Germany is not because you wanted to meet me, but because you wanted to flee from some kind of a psychotic episode in the US.
Actually, the reason that I first scheduled the trip to Europe was European equities were becoming increasingly important to me, and I wanted to do more due diligence in Europe. I'm a great believer to understand an economy, you have to be in it. So the original impetus was to become a little bit more familiar with the European equity markets and economy. But by the time I left the United States, yes, I was also interested in fleeing the psychotic episode.
And this is basically the presidential race, right?
It's a combination of the presidential race, and it was also the Pope's visit I would include.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, why do you become more interested in the European equity markets?
Simply because they're of opportunities. You know, the U.S. market has done very, very well over the last couple of years. You know, has come up a lot, and so that has drawn everyone, you know, towards the American markets. But Europe has done better than the U.S. markets this year, and then came during a correction, really came down, and so there were opportunities to get very good European equities, and I just felt that the period of the U.S. markets diverging way ahead of the rest of the world was probably coming to an end.
But do you think that the American equity markets will do fine now that interest rates in the U.S. are left unchanged?
It's impossible to tell. I think we are probably still in a long-term bull market, and the equity markets in the developed world are probably going to continue to do well for the next couple of years. It's my guess.
But do you expect that the Federal Reserve will not change interest rates this year?
Lars, I thought they were going to raise them in the fall, just by very nominal amounts. And I still believe they're going to try and raise them by nominal amounts if there's any way they can before the end of the year. Part of the reason for my thinking is you have seen the pension funds and the insurance companies and savers really hurt by essentially a zero interest rate policy. And I'm not sure how long you can continue to ignore that sector of the economy.
But is it really possible for the United States to raise interest rates in a substantial way?
I believe so. I think what they're worried about are a number of things. One is the global economy is slower than they anticipated, and the U.S. economy is slower than anticipated. The other thing is you've created an enormous number of dollar borrowers around the world. And if you raise interest rates even by a nominal amount, it's going to be very supportive of the dollar. That's going to put the emerging markets in a tough position, particularly people who are depending on commodities for revenues. And one of the things the U.S. is sensitive to is a higher dollar is going to be bad for corporate earnings. And so the equity markets is going to, when the U.S. dollar index went over 100, you could see the corporate guys were, because they're going to have to consolidate foreign earnings back. So I think there's pressure on the other side for corporate earnings to keep whatever interest rates hikes happen, keep them down.
Do you think that the quote-unquote powers that be could have an interest in a rising gold price vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar?
Probably not yet. So if anything, with commodities under the pressure they are and the slowdown happening, if anything, I'm worried that gold could take another step down before the bull market reasserts.
Yeah, and why so?
Just because I don't think we found a bottom yet, and I think if you look at the geopolitics, the danger is we're in a deflation, and a deflation where you could really see commodities continue to be under pressure across the board.
Do you think that quantitative easing, in contrast what a lot of people anticipated, did not create inflation but actually deflation?
Well, it was both. It certainly created inflation in parts of the economy. I think what it has done is it's eroded confidence in the general integrity of the political and financial systems, which is very deflationary. So it's a cross current. You have certainly an inflationary effect coming from putting that much money into the pocket of various people. But as on the other hand, people sort of lose faith in the system, you see the multiplier effect diminishing.
Yeah. Do you expect another round of quantitative easing?
I certainly expect one in Europe. It wouldn't surprise me if we saw another one in the United States.
And how about negative interest rates? Actually, people in the United States are talking about this. Like, for example, Mr. Dudley, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Yeah. Lars, I don't know. We're certainly seeing it in the market. So I was teasing you that we saw German bonds go to negative interest rates last week. What's interesting is the week the Fed didn't raise interest rates, the market raised the interest rates for them.
Yeah. Now, what are your thinking of the global equity markets? Like, for example, we saw some difficulties recently in China.
Well, the Chinese market was up almost 30% for the year. Same with the German, the DAX was up almost 30%. And then came, the Chinese market swung to a negative 15% at the bottom. So we've seen quite a drop. So it's a very sizable correction. And we know it ran up heavily on margin. The question is, why did it come down so fast and hard? And I think part of the reason is relates to economic warfare between the East and West, which is why I think it's so important right now to talk about the global order and how we're going to cooperate and get along. But I think the real question about the Chinese market in the future, well, let me just step back because I find the Chinese stock market very fascinating. 25 years ago, the Chinese market was recreated after almost 40 years of no stock markets in China. And China has gone from a situation where literally their stock market is $0 to one in which it's, if you include Hong Kong, it's 1/7 of the entire global float, which is extraordinary when you think about 25 years from 0 to 1/7. Or if you if you include Hong Kong, it's say 15% of the global float. If you don't include Hong Kong, it's 10%. That's awfully big. And if you look at the size of China and the potential for growth, it could get even bigger. And I think that my question after watching the Chinese stock market come down as fast and hard as it did is, do we really want the global float to succeed or to fail? And if you look at some of the economic warfare that's gone on over the last year, I think there's a real question. If you're going to put money in the Chinese stock market, then you're going to want it to succeed. At the same time, if the G7 wants China to fail or to stay part of the existing order, then the Chinese stock market may not go anywhere.
Now, China has domestic problems in the equity market, in the housing market.
Yeah.
However, it has some very big growth potential in Eurasia with this infrastructure project, One Road, One Belt. What are your thoughts on this Eurasian integration through commerce?
Right. Well, China has made a major contribution to keeping the global economy going since 2008, and they did it by levering up. And what you see in the West is a real desire to have China start really develop their consumer markets. That doesn't seem to be working any near much as what people wanted. A lot of that money that China borrowed went into housing and the real estate, the property bubble, as well as infrastructure. And so I think the question is, can China take their infrastructure skills, which are growing and improving, and build out regionally, around the world. And I think this gets us back to the economic warfare, because we saw China kick off the Asian Infrastructure Bank, and has been moving around the world, encouraging and doing what we used to do with the XM Bank and the World Bank, but financing projects and trying to build regionally, and that's gotten a serious pushback from the U.S. and the G7. So the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. It gets back to this question of, the U.S. and China as Siamese twins that keep fighting. Are we going to allow China to grow? And if we do, is China going to insist on changing the global order or not? Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the tension. The G7 wants to keep the global order as is, and China, as they continue to grow, want to change the global order.
Now, if you were calling the shots in Washington, how would you cope with China?
That's a very good question, and I don't have the intelligence to know. I don't have the intelligence to know what I would do. But I think I would certainly be reluctant to let the, if you will, the global order change too fast. But to do that, the global order is going to have to work for everybody. So one of the reasons that we saw the development of the Asian Infrastructure Bank is that the existing institutions that were building out infrastructure were not responding and basically doing the kinds of things they needed to be doing. So what I would do is I would move to fill the vacuum.
But instead, the West is pushing Russia and China closer to each other.
Yeah.
This is, of course, one advantage for China is that it can, for example, get energy from Russia on the Eurasian soil. And it doesn't have to get the energy from the sea lanes that are controlled by the Americans.
Right.
So for them, this is a win-win situation.
Maybe, although my guess is there's still, the Asian energy cost is still very high compared to the Americas. It's one of our America's greatest competitive energy is the low energy price.
Yeah. High energy price is bad for China, but it's good for Russia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I suspect that's one of the reasons why the price right now is so low.
Yeah. But do you think that one day that let's say the Americans are interested in hurting China via...
Yeah, I think one of the reasons the oil price ran so high was to try and checkmate the Chinese. It's funny, if you look at the management of the oil price, we flip, it's kind of a multiple personality disorder. We flip between trying to checkmate the Chinese or hurt the Russians.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's, if you hurt one, you help the other.
Yeah. And what do you think about the state of the fracking industry in the United States? It has a lot of liabilities.
Right. Well, when you bring the price down, in the fracking industry, you've got an extraordinary amount of debt, and you're bringing the price down in a way that they can't cover their debt costs. And of course, you have derivatives on top of that. So if you look at the junk market in the last month and a half, it's traded off 5 to 10%, depending on what you're looking at. And that's the pain being caused to commodity producers, both whether it's the companies or the countries that are dependent on commodities revenues. If you look at a lot of the companies, though, what you're seeing is that it depends on their cost structure, but for many of them that I'm familiar with, they can still make money down into the 30s. So the problem you have globally is, to the extent somebody can make money down into the 30s, they continue to provide more and more supply.
What we see now is that new investment is halted. And so does this mean in the future higher prices?
Well, it means eventually supply and demand are going to come back into balance. But there's going to be, if you look at everybody who's got debt, who's depending on commodities revenues, I think it could take a while for supply and demand to come back into balance at a higher price.
Mm-hmm. Now, another topic you would like to talk about is quote-unquote personal action for real change.
Yeah. So every 4 years, America lives through a psychotic episode where they spend an inordinate amount of time voting for somebody who has no impact on real policies. And so every 4 years, I try and persuade Americans that it is absolutely important that they start to look at the areas of their life where they can impact real change. And, we were talking earlier today at lunch where I said, if we would all simply make our money or spend our time doing things that help other people instead of harming other people, it would make an extraordinary difference. And I kind of feel as though in America, we are focused on avenues of action that have absolutely no impact on the real machinery, whereas we ignore all the things in our daily life at an intimate level that could have an enormous impact. Imagine this Christmas if everybody who sat down at a dining table who discovered themselves next to a partner at Goldman Sachs got up and said, "I refuse to eat with anybody from Goldman Sachs," and walked away. It would be quite dramatic.
Now, in 2008, you had a candidate who was talking constantly about change. Now his 2 terms are coming to an end. How would you describe the presidency of Barack Obama? What was the purpose?
I think the presidency has been phenomenally successful for the people who financed it and arranged it.
Yeah, but why? Lots of people are disappointed.
Well,
but those who gave the money, they're not.
No, I think the people who financed and arranged the presidency of Barack Obama are thrilled with the result.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, overtly, you spent $1 billion. God knows how much you spent covertly, but what you got was $27 trillion. Basically of refinancing for the G7 banks that financed the global coup d'etat. So you basically consolidated a financial coup d'etat, and you got $27 trillion of liabilities moved out of private hands into the governments. So you basically stole, at the end of the day, about $40 trillion, and you got away with it because he recapitalized the banks after it was over. So you got $27 trillion, which you could never, you needed, if I assure you George W. Bush and Dick Cheney could never have gotten the kind of popular support you needed to engineer that kind of, sort of global heist. So that was the first thing you got. You got everything you needed from a regulatory or legal standpoint to re-engineer healthcare and education in the U.S. federally in a way that re-engineers those over the next 10 years all into Silicon Valley and strips labor and strips local economies. And it's an extraordinary creation of mandated monopolies, by federal government that will put enormous wealth and control into the pockets of a very few. And then you've gotten the Trans-Pacific Partnership passed, and all the meantime, you've been proceeding to do what you're doing in Africa and the Middle East, and you've had a nice, handsome African-American face as the front. And, it's hard for me to believe that you could get away with that kind of, intentional violence in the Middle Eastern and the African communities without having that face. So if you look at the financial results, whether it's bailout, mandates in healthcare and education, Trans-Pacific Partnership, or what's been going on in the Middle East and Africa, I think it's been an extraordinarily successful investment on their part.
Has America seen its best days already, or as most candidates would say, the best is yet to come for America?
I think a lot depends on how we sort out what the new global order is going to be and what America's role is going to be. We're rebalancing the global economy, and so America is going from being a dominant force. We ended World War II and we controlled 50% of the GNP globally, and ultimately that's going to go down to a much smaller percentage. So the question is, what's America's role going to be in the global order, number one, and then how is our success in technology and in all the things that implies? And the answer is, I don't know. And the thing that concerns me is America right now, the West has always been successful primarily because they were good at warfare and violence. But when you rebalance the global economy, you go from a model where basically the G7 is harvesting everybody else for their benefit to something that has to be successful without anybody systematically harvesting anybody else. So that's a very deep change. I've talked about the fact that we've been dependent on the central banking warfare model for 500 years. That has to change. So how do we do that change successfully? And if we get that change right successfully, then America's going to be a very interesting, could even be a very fantastic place. If we get that change wrong, we're going to have a very major global mess, and what that looks like is anybody's guess. But that's the change we've got to get right. Now, my concern about getting that change right is what we've watched in the last 20, 30 years. The leadership in America has gotten progressively more inhuman and perverted. And I think some of what you're seeing globally is simply just an aversion to that, whatever that inhuman thing is. And I think the question is, my fear is that America have a failure of imagination, and whatever transformation we need to do internally and externally to get to a new order that we don't do and we don't figure out right. That's what we've got to do. And if you look at our current leadership, it's so corrupt that I just, I worry about America. At the same time, if you look at all the different sort of resources and aspects that we have, there's no reason that we can't get it right.
Yeah, but is it really only corruption at the higher places that is a problem for the US? Or does it go deeper?
Well, it's, again, it goes back to, who's really in control of G7. And that's the mystery that we're all trying to figure out. I will say this. When you have a phase where you're engineering a financial coup d'etat, you need leadership that's very good at fraud and lying. When you decide that you're going to cooperate globally and you have to show leadership in infrastructure, in governance issues, in trade negotiations, in all sorts of hard and complex things, you need a very different kind of leadership. So I think if you look at a lot of the current leaderships, they came up because they were good at lying and they were good at financial fraud and they were good at, doing 9/11 or these other things. I think there's a call for a different kind of leadership, and I think that's part of why they, chose Barack Obama instead of some of the more same old, same old. Our problem now in the current election is we're back and we've got a lot of same old, same old. Mm. So I do think there is a shift in leadership that's got to happen if America's going to be successful, and I don't see it happening right now.
What do you think about the European leadership when it comes to A, the Euro crisis, and B, the refugee crisis right now?
Well, I'm afraid the European leadership is engineering the refugee migration just to ensure that they can maintain control. So you're watching a kind of social engineering that's very negative, particularly if you're here in Europe. So, but this keeps coming back to, we have a leadership that keeps trying to centralize control. I think one of the reasons that they are trying to centralize control as much as they are, Lars, is they're trying to compete with Asia. You have a rising Asia. It's, it's 2 to 3 billion people, and you have, U.S. and Europe in terms of population are much smaller, and you're trying to force central aggregation so that you can compete head-on with this much larger rising force. And a lot of that, if you're sitting here watching, if you're on the brunt of them doing it, it doesn't make any sense. But they're trying to build up aggregations and blocks that then compete with something larger. At the same time, what I'm seeing is that they're destroying fundamental productivity in the economies. And they're destroying faith in the system.
Do you think that Europe, in order to save the euro, it destroys its future?
I don't think it destroys its future, but I think it's destroying a lot of its human capital.
Yeah. But why so? And why do you think no one is really interested in this?
Oh, I think fantastic number of people are interested. Yeah. Yeah, I think a fantastic number of people are interested, both in the, if you talk to Europeans and United States, if Americans, if you look at the polls, I think the interest and the frustration and the anger with, all the different things the leaderships are doing to centralize control, I think there's enormous frustration. I also think people are afraid of talking about it openly and don't know what to do. And that's why I come back to it's so important to take action in our everyday life, because that's the change that's going to make a huge difference. The place that we've stopped centralization in the United States is where we were willing to take action in our lives. And you've seen again and again where we've been able to just say no and stop it.
But I think you would say that there's a lot of resistance because when, for example, one place can change in a centralized system, all can change.
Right.
And so this has to be prevented.
Well, that's why I think it's so important that we have a global conversation about who's centralizing things and what we do about it. Because we're all going to have to take action together.
Yeah.
And, some of those things can just be within a country, but more and more this is going to happen through consumer action and consumer aggregation, or investor action, investor aggregation.
One last question when it comes to change. Would you say that a crucial goal should be to make education and knowledge smart and cool again and not being dumb? I'm stupid. This is cool. And we have to make a new cool, that it's cool to be educated and knowledgeable.
Well, I think you're asking the question, how do we save Western culture?
Is this impossible?
No, it's not impossible. I think it's not impossible at all. And I think it's happening in pockets. What I would say is that the greatest tool that the current establishment has is what I call entrainment technology.
Please explain this.
Yeah. So if you look at what is possible through digital and electrical systems, it is possible to use electromagnetic technology that can literally influence your thoughts and influence your minds. And some people call it mind control. But I have a great Solera report on entrainment technology and subliminal programming, but we are consuming more and more very powerful mind control technology, and this can be marketed to you through your TV, through your smartphone, and unfortunately a lot of people don't understand that it exists.
Yeah.
And the reality is that if we're going to bring about real change, a certain number of people, it doesn't have to be everybody, are going to have to proceed forward and develop a very powerful immune system to that technology.
Yeah, but do you think that it happens, for example, via symbolism, so that people are adopting symbols, wearing, for example, symbols, using symbols, but they don't actually know what those symbols are standing for originally?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely happening.
Yeah, and this happens, for example, through music videos.
Yeah.
Yeah, popular culture. Okay, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you, Lars.